Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Pressing Forward podcast. On today's episode, we have Dr. Tetreault. Did I say that right?
Tetro?
Tetreault, okay. And today's topic is going to be on mindfulness and just, the different aspects of being more mindful. So I'll give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, your expertise, what do you do? So, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm a neuroscientist, and my goal is to offer the most promising neuroscience and medical breakthroughs in positive psychology so people can live their best lives. And maybe a similarity that may feel just like you is that I was in graduate school. I had a mother who was struggling with a neurodegenerative disease called Parkinson's. And there was a lot of anxiety and mental health challenges related to the pressures of being a young mother, of having a mother that was quite ill, and being in graduate school. Um, and I found the doorway of meditation to be one way that I can really learn to recenter my mind and be with the experiences as they arise rather than trying to push away difficult emotions or experiences I was having. Um, so a lot like you, I've wanted to really offer doorways to people who may be suffering and help guide them with practices that have worked for me.
So you talked about just that element of, dealing with anxiety pertaining to your mother. When were you like introduced to meditation? Like when did you discover meditation and how did you get into that?
Yeah, well, my first meditation was really introduced through yoga classes when I was in graduate school. And for the first time in my life, I was able to sit in a pose called Shavasana, where you just lie on the ground. A lot of people may be familiar with that. And um, it's a moment where you die and you're reborn. And I kind of loved that experience of feeling that I don't have to be the story or the spirit experience that I am. And so that was my first introduction. And then as I kind of progressed, I really started doing trainings. And I started actually a pretty intensive dance and yoga practice where I was in my body, and that was my meditation. And dancing for me, I felt layers of connection to the universe in the fact that I felt so much gratitude that I had a body that worked. Whereas my mother with Parkinson's, it's a motor disorder. And I knew her body was failing her, that she couldn't take certain types of walks. And so there was gratitude, gratitude that I had my body and the awareness that my mother didn't. And so it was starting to shape my consciousness to kind of live more in a meditative practice. And then upon my graduation, my mom really had only 3 months left to live. And I decided to not take a job in academia, and I stepped away and I cared for her and I was with her. And that's really, I think, when my living meditation practice began, was learning to sit with her in silence and not having to fix or do or change anything about the experience. And then I started taking mindfulness courses through Insight Meditation at Insight LA. And then from there on, just took pretty much any meditation course and training that I came in contact with to learn more.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question was how you got you pretty much answered it. But so how much of that mindfulness and those things that you were able to gain from exercising and yoga and things like that, how much of that mindfulness guides the work that you do now?
It touches everything I do. Every time I give a talk, I lead with a meditation. Anytime that somebody is struggling, I look at it as a moment to celebrate my practice and what are the techniques I can use? How can I bring in more compassion? How can I bring equanimity and awareness? If somebody tells me good news, how do I bring in joyful enthusiasm for their happiness? And so it's really, for me, it's meditation isn't about sitting on the cushion,
Okay.
although that is a formal practice.
Yeah.
For me, it's how do I, for example, drive in traffic and have the awareness that, well, we're in traffic and we're in this together. And I get to drive in traffic. And, oh, my fellow human being needs to get over a lane. How do I let you in? Rather than saying, this is my spot and my stance. How can I cause ease when there's challenge? I would say as it gets more into a meditative practice, when things come into awareness of social action, I'm still a student in that, in the sense that I can see a homeless person on the street and have the awareness and, at the time deciphering in my mind, how can I sit with that and that fellow human, offer compassion as well as hold the suffering. And so I think that's still a huge practice. I have a teenage son. Sometimes he likes to let me know what he knows.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so how do I, as a mom, compassionately, with a sternness, hold space and set a boundary if I think if his behavior or his tone isn't something that I want to take in at that moment. And so it's woven in everything. I'm far from imperfect, and I take a beginner's mind at every moment. I think as human beings, I don't sit here as somebody that knows all the answers. I'll share what has worked for me.
Yeah.
And I also love learning from other people. When I was younger, I worked as a cashier in a grocery store. And I remember all the different people that came in, and they all had so many different stories. And there was one day I was sitting there, or I was standing, and I was checking someone out, and I thought, there isn't anybody I can't learn something from.
Right.
And it really opened me to realize that I can learn from anybody. And so that's kind of the openness I think that a meditative practice also provides.
Got you. So it seems like for you, that meditative practice has allowed you to increase your, self-awareness and just, be able to be more aware of what's going on around you. So for individuals that aren't familiar with what mindfulness is, what is it, and where does it actually stem from?
Yeah, that's a great question. So mindfulness is really stemmed from meditation, and meditation came, over several thousand years ago from Asia, specifically in India, where they were having modes of practices for meditation. And mindfulness is one of the core 6 to 7 meditative practices. And so you really have mindfulness, which is a way that you tune in to your experience without pushing it away. And then another form of a meditative practice is concentration, for example, where you focus on the breath. And then you kind of get into awareness, where where you're really allowing experiences to happen as they are without shifting or changing them. And then there's these heartful practices called loving awareness and loving and compassion practices that kind of are heart openers. And then we have inquiry, where you kind of have these koans and you say, what am I doing here? What's life? What is this? Who are we? And that's really an inquiry practice. And that could come up where people could experience a lot of doubt in their practices. And then you have kind of another layer of devotional practices where people use mantra and they use different types of chanting. And that really kind of invokes chanting, kind of ways to move energy and get into a really heartful sense. And then the final one is embodiment, where you do it kind of every day in life. And so mindfulness is part of one of the 6 main meditative practices.
I got you. So I know the accurate picture or the picture that most people get of mindfulness is usually the meditation sitting in a seat with your shoulders up and broad shoulders, things like that. So how does mindfulness been shown to actually impact the brain?
Yeah, so, well, there's a couple of things, you said about sitting in a seat, and I work with a lot of neurodiverse people. And when we talk about neurodiversity, it's like an umbrella of individuals who have different brain wiring and they experience their environment differently. And sometimes the standard sitting practice may not work. So, for example, if you have a person who has a more active mind, and say they're cognitively diverse with different attentional issues or differences, you may want to have a practice where you do a meditative walk. And there are these things called an awe walk where people go out, look at the environment, and they pay attention and tune in to their environment and notice butterflies or birds and trees. And so a meditation practice does not have to be something that is standard on sitting on a cushion. And then like the second part you were asking about, what was the second question?
How does it exactly like impact the brain? Just
Yeah,
brain
so
functioning.
Yeah, so there's been over 16,500 different studies
Wow.
to show how meditation and mindfulness can really change a person in the sense where they have more in tune communication, they're more compassionate, can reduce things like anxiety, depression, allows people to have increased creativity. More morality and social consciousness, improvements in interpersonal relationships and in communication, as well as greater empathy and compassion for others. And when you look at it and you think about the brain, there's been specific studies that show that you can really rewire your brain. There's this area of the amygdala. It's kind of like this almond shape inside your brain, which is our first primary emotional response to fear. And then you have this frontal cortex here, which is really important right here. This dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex is really important for executive functioning and decision making, and going ahead with in-tune communication and things like that. And that part of the brain they show through doing a very specific mindfulness-based stress reduction protocol for 40 minutes a day for 8 weeks. And this was the original one that Jon Kabat-Zinn came back from and taught in hospitals. They found that the brain, the amygdala area reduced in size, the fear area, and the area of the frontal cortex really expanded. And
Wow.
this allows people to have greater regulation of their emotions, greater communication, and connection with others.
That's I just learned a lot too. Even with the structure that you brought out, I felt like I was in anatomy again. But so for anybody who wanted to start out in mindfulness practice, I guess, is it difficult to start off in?
It's a mind state, right? And I think that, sometimes, I think when you think about the word challenge or difficulty, I mean, it's perspective. Ram Dass, he's one of like the world leaders, where he brought meditation back to the West. He would say that he would sit there for 7 hours and meditate straight. And it would look like he was meditating and he would be having some wild fantasy. And so the idea that, you have to sit on your cushion and you can't move, and the point of meditation is to bring you back again and again and again to the present moment. And so whether or not you sit down and you quiet your mind for, 1 to 15 minutes a day, and you sit there and you have one good second where you're in tune with your awareness, that's progress. And each time you do that, you shape a new neural network. And what they show is that actually a great study showed that just practicing 13 minutes a day of meditation allows you to train that muscle. Wow. And train that wiring pattern. The other thing to let people know is we've kind of been co-opted and misinformed by people to tell us that, a new habit only takes 30 days. Yeah. A study showed that it actually takes up to 18 to 365 days, depending how difficult the task is. So, for example, participants went all the way from drinking a cup of water to running 15 minutes at lunchtime, let's say. And the people who drank a cup of water, they learned how to master that skill automatically within 18 days or so. People who ran, it took them closer to like 66 days. And so I think the other thing too to remember about a practice is that it may take 66 days or plus to see those effects. For me, when I think about mindfulness and, the challenges of sitting, when I started out in my early days, I started out with guided meditations that are found on like Insight Timer, or they're found on different Sounds True. And, when I think about the embodiment of meditation, an important element to think about when it's working, I kind of spill stuff, even though I was a scientist and in a lab, I'm spill. I'm a prone person to spill. And this one day I had spilled water all over, and there was a minute in my head where I said, "Oh, you Dumbo, you idiot." Yeah. And then I said, "Oh, wait, that's what towels are for. Spills happen. It's okay." And that's the shift of how do I soften those self-critical thoughts? How do I soften these very difficult stories I've programmed in my mind of what it is to be a perfection or how it is to do things? And so so when we think about it, I really invite people to explore the different types of meditation, to not just say, I'm going to sit here in silence for 15 minutes. There's tons of music on Spotify. That's meditative music you can listen to, or guided meditations. And I would recommend, finding the areas where you can find support. Also, some people can't sit. It's okay to lie down. I let people know a lot in my early years. The first time that I really started insight meditation, I slept. I fell asleep. Oh, wow. And then I would come back out of meditation, and, and my teacher would say, "It's okay. Your body needed rest. That's okay." And then I learned and I trained my mind, the concentration, to not fall asleep. And there's techniques. You could keep one foot up. There's all different ways you could keep the alertness happening as well. And so there's a lot of barriers somebody could come up against, and at the same time, finding the avenue that works, maybe a heartful practice of just teaching yourself the meta phrases and practicing those, could be a really great way, to navigate from class to class, not getting bumped on campus.
And one of the things that you talked about, and just from what I picked up, as with anything, it takes time to build an effective habit. It takes time to master something. So, how would this help somebody who say has anxiety?
Well, I think that for anxiety, I mean, that's really the one reason why I personally went to that I began to meditate. And what I found was by expanding my ability to sit in my breath and to quiet my mind, over time I began to train my brain that not every anxious thought I experienced and do experience is true.
Hmm.
That anxiety really comes from a fear based emotion. And what meditation has brought for me is how can I reset my window of tolerance and pay attention that this may feel challenging, and where can I bring myself compassion and love to myself in this moment?
Gotcha. And so you've actually written a book called The Insight on a Bright Mind. Can you talk more about that book? What was the motivation behind writing that book?
Yeah, so Insight into a Bright Mind, I wrote, it has a very long story to it, but it's here. And it was about really to shape our awareness around neurodiversity, um, and recognizing that 1 in 5 people in our society are neurodiverse, which really encompasses people who are, on the autism spectrum, ADHD, gifted, have sensory processing, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dyslexia. And I really wanted to reshape our dialogue, our communication about these brain differences to have more inclusion and more compassion in our society. What I've noticed in these different populations is, first and foremost, it's 1 in 5 people. So it's 20% of our population tends to be neurodiverse. And when we think about at school and we think about in jobs, how do we create greater equity and diversity within this community? And so, what I really wanted to do is highlight. I interviewed over 15 people, had their personal stories, and then I wrote about the neuroscience that supports why different brain types have natural gifts to give our society, and how we really need to change our structures in our thinking about intelligence, in our thinking about inclusion, to allow for diversity in these different types of brain wiring.
I love that. And where can people actually find this? Can you show us the book again?
Oh
Where can
yeah,
you find it?
it's found pretty much anywhere books are sold, and yeah, it's on Kindle too if people like that version, and so you can find it on Amazon pretty easily and any bookstore.
Gotcha. And I just want to be cognizant of the time that we have left. So usually how we wrap up the show is leaving the audience with one piece of advice. What would that advice be?
Yeah, well, one piece of advice is to recognize you're okay exactly where you're at. There isn't anything you have to do or fix or change about yourself. You're exactly perfect as you are. And I mean, I think a technique for them to use in terms of meditation for themselves is to allow themselves 3 deep breaths. Scientifically, we know taking 3 deep breaths really recenters our nervous system. It reduces our heart rate. It allows us to have a parasympathetic response. And then we get an increase in positive neurochemicals for trust, which are oxytocin and vasopressin. And we learn to have more trusting connections with people. So anytime you're going into a big test or a big performance, or say you're going out and you're going to go out on the field and play football, give yourself that moment to recenter your mind and take really 2 deep breaths. three deep breaths and recenter that nervous system.
I love that advice because we have a lot of young professionals, young athletes that, tune into the show. So I think that should be super helpful for any individuals who might be, suffering or just even, I guess dealing with some of those things. So, where can the people find you and the services that you offer?
Yeah, so I'm at NicoleTetreault.com. I'm on Instagram and Twitter and a couple other platforms as Awesome Neuro. I'm gonna be launching a bunch of series on YouTube and TikTok videos, short videos, um, on kind of the positives of neuroscience and meditation. So look out for those, and it's Awesome Neuro.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Thank you, Dr. Tetreault, and I appreciate you joining me on today's show. And
Thank you.
hopefully people were able to, not only learn about, mindfulness, but just even your story. And I appreciate you for joining me again.
Oh, thank you for having me, and thank you for all the beautiful your work you're doing to help athletes out there and all people all around the world.
Definitely. Thank you.